Welcome back to Prepared to Prevail, where our goal is to bring you helpful and actionable information from industry professionals that help you on your journey to daily preparedness and an upgraded level of capability. Today, we're going to be talking about building and maintaining a safety team within a church. The intent of this session is going to be to address a full spectrum comprehensive ministry framework, really focusing on built to last and that servant mindset. So keeping in mind that we're building this team out and its function is to best serve the church, those within it, and anybody that might come into contact with our ministry teams, our church family, and really anything related to the activities of the church's function and hosting services, events, and anything like that. What's going to be encouraged throughout this session is professionalism, intentionality, ministry alignment, training, ongoing. This session will provide some good framework, but there is a huge spectrum of training and other things that are going to be a long-term strategy that needs to be in place, and then winning. So what I mean by winning is best being positioned to, even in dynamic critical incidents, but even on the lower scale of intensity, being able to be best positioned to have a positive outcome on the backside of any issues that may arise, whether they're minor or major. What this session is not, it's not a fear-based scare tactic session built to try to convince you that all the scary things in the world are knocking on your door. While there is realities of good and evil in the world, we're not going to be focusing on too much of the scare tactics there. Tactical Timmy 101, this is also not going to be a session where we're going to go through strapping a gun on is the only answer to everything, because that is simply not the case. So we're going to focus on some more holistic procedures, processes, mindset, and that kind of stuff for the bulk of the issues that a church is going to face. And there is that aspect that needs to be addressed, which is active violence situations and response to that. We will talk through that, but holistically, the bulk of what we're going to discuss is going to be pretty much everything else. This is also not the destination. As you'll see throughout, we're cracking the can of worms open here, but we're not going to be able to digest the whole can of worms in this short session. So there is some additional training and resources and things that need to go along with this, where we'll talk about seeking other individuals' opinions, perspectives, other trainings, and putting that all together to create a system that works best for you, your team, and your church. This is also not legal advice. I'm not an attorney, and we're not giving legal advice here in this session, nor should we, but we'll talk about when it's time to talk with an attorney and make sure that everything is good there. But key point being, no legal advice given here, just suggestions, guidelines, and things that we see as best practices within a multitude of churches. Churches are open and welcoming. Safety is the foundation that enables all other functions, and that's pretty broadly applied to societies, organizations, anything that has any type of societal function. So that's why this is so important that we do this well, because if we don't have safety as that foundation for all other ministries to flourish, then we can run into issues. One example I would give is a lady that took her kids to a church. At the end of the vacation Bible school, all the kids come running out of the church. No order, no idea of really which kids are going to who. And when that lady picked her kids up, she just felt that kids weren't accounted for. Nobody really knew who was picking up what kid, and she did not ever attend that church again. I'm sure it was a great church. She didn't have anything bad to say other than safety was a concern, and that just made her feel uncomfortable. So she didn't continue the vacation Bible school with her kids, didn't attend on a Sunday. She was already attending another church anyways, but in my opinion, that church likely missed an opportunity to connect with her and her family, and safety is just a very, very important aspect to not only ensuring that people are safe when they're in that environment, but also that they feel safe, because that builds confidence in all the other aspects of the ministry work that's being conducted as well. So before we really dive in here, some big things we got to hit on is some definitions and really just framing what all we're talking about and why. And that'll really help with some of these discussions as you're either building your team or refining it, revising things. So the first thing we start off with is the definition of safe. According to Google, I don't have a specific source other than Googling it there. One of the definitions that popped up that made sense was the condition of being protected from or unlikely to cause danger, risk, or injury. It's just a very basic definition of what it means to be safe. Without dwelling on that too much, what our suggestion here would be is looking more at what we would consider the definition of a safe environment. We would define that as an environment void of unacceptable risk. In the next slide here, we'll talk a lot about what is acceptable risk versus unacceptable risk and why that's important. So jokingly here, I'll say that a guaranteed method to achieve a safe environment, it's not fully a joke, but anybody that wants to guarantee you that they can eliminate all risk and make it the perfect bubble wrapped environment, I would be cautious with that statement. But really, if you're kind of looking for that guaranteed method, you really have to look at eliminating the environment or eliminating the risk. Risk is impossible to eliminate, even simply walking down a sidewalk or stepping in your car, driving down the road. Every activity that we do as human beings involves some level of risk. I think we all know somebody that can just trip over their own 2 feet walking on a flat floor. It happens. There's inherent risk, and we have to be conscious that we can't just make any environment risk-free, which brings us back to that first one, eliminating the environment. My opinion, eliminating churches being the environment we're discussing here is non-negotiable and not even an option. There are some environments that could be eliminated. For example, if you were hosting an event at your home or some type of private place or a park or something like that, and there's very credible threats and things that are just lining up that don't make it make sense to have that event, or even a tornado or something like that, you could just cancel the event. But we don't have that option because we cannot cancel church service. It's a very necessary thing. So that also becomes not an option, just like eliminating risk entirely is not an option. So realistically, the option that we have is to enact systems and processes to manage acceptable risk. And we'll talk through that a little bit more here. What is acceptable versus unacceptable risk? Because like mentioned, it can't be eliminated. So risk can be managed. So when we talk about acceptable, we're talking about something that the group, the church, the community can agree that we're okay with this level of risk. Some examples would be, one that's very applicable here is a gathering place of people, because some risks that just come right along with that is, we're in a northern state here, so wintertime, slip and fall on the way in, that kind of stuff is an inherent risk that happens fairly often if you look at, all the different churches and places that people worship. So gathering people together is going to have inherent risks associated with that. There's going to be medicals that will happen. There might be disgruntled and upset people that spirals and turns into confrontations and physical incidents. Another church specific one, unless your church hosts skydiving classes or something like that, would be skydiving with proper equipment and training. So namely being an instructor and a parachute. So if we have an instructor and a parachute, most people that are interested in skydiving would say that that's an acceptable way to conduct that activity. Whereas unacceptable on that example would be skydiving without a parachute, without an instructor, without the proper tools, equipment, and knowledge, because I think we would all agree that if we jump out of a plane just with the clothes on our back, that's not going to end well. So that's unacceptable risk, not worth it. Another one more applicable to churches would be known viable threats. So if we have a individual that has a history of victimizing little kids, we would not allow that person to serve in children's ministry. So you have to really define what those acceptable versus unacceptable risks are. Going back to like that known viable threat, the example I gave of someone with a history of victimizing kids, we're not going to let that person serve in children's ministry, especially if they haven't made changes and aren't repentant and all that good stuff. That's one where it's pretty black and white that we're not going to put kids in that situation to be victimized by that known individual. Whereas with on the acceptable side, anybody we bring into a serving role has potential brokenness that we may just not know about. So if we're talking about somebody serving coffee and we've done a background check and we have good references and that kind of stuff, Same thing with serving in the children's ministry. Hopefully that's a little more in depth where we're doing background checks and reference checks and really digging a little bit deeper, especially as we're giving them access to the children. Same thing with leaders, where we're making sure that small group leaders and youth leaders and that kind of stuff all have proper vetting so that we're making sure that we're being good stewards of the safety of the people they're overseeing and having access to. So again, making sure that that conversation is had up front as we know that some risks are unacceptable. So we're going to go ahead and cut those right out of the gate and put some procedures and processes in place so that those are way, way less likely to happen. And then on the acceptable side, just knowing that we can't completely remove all possibility of bad things happening and risk. How do we go about managing that acceptable risk? Because this is going to be key, which is going to take us into the bulk of what we're going to be talking about here. Procedures and processes, continuity amongst different ministry teams. So we want to make sure that this safety team is not being treated like a hired private security company, because that's not what it is. It's a ministry team within the church where we're working together with other ministry teams. We're keeping people safe. We're being proactive. We're seeing things ahead of time and taking steps to make sure that safety doesn't slip. But at the same time, not being so rigid that we're trying to turn this church into a prison, because it does still need to be open and welcoming, but controlled. And then when it comes to working through things where we're bringing in other ministry teams, we'll talk about that connection of resources. That'll come up a couple times throughout this session here. So making sure that it's a good fluid culture of the safety team working with all the other ministry teams and the ministry teams working with the safety team. That's something that can be a challenge. Sometimes safety teams have a tendency to kind of take on the secret squirrel mentality where we know what we do and we don't need to explain it to everybody. That's not a good best practice, because that's going to be a environment that can foster some friction and some things like that. Policy, SOPs, SOGs, we'll talk about EAPs too. So standard operating procedures, standard operating guidelines, and emergency action plans. Those are going to be where we're going to dig into what are those, what are the differences, why do they matter, and we'll be digging through that in depth here in the middle of the session. Preparation and training, that's going to be key. We want to make sure that we're prepared and planned. So if you fail to plan, that's basically planning to fail. Because if we don't have a plan in place and we're just flying by the seat of our pants, that's where we don't have the ability to foresee things and control some of the controllables. Training's another aspect of that. So you see some overlap on preparation and training because they really go hand in hand. If you want to break them out, you can think of preparation as procedures, processes, written things, but training has a lot of preparation involved in it too, in terms of equipment. On the preparation side, you're acquiring that equipment, making sure it's there, making sure people have their own equipment, because there's going to be a lot of personally owned equipment involved in this, but then other complementary things that are on site and shared equipment, and then training on all of that. So the training coming into, if we have documented standard operating procedures, standard operating guidelines, how are the team members to navigate that? Some different chain of command type stuff we'll talk about, but training on all of this stuff so everybody's on the same page, has repetition, and we have that good cohesive team environment. Costs of unpreparedness can be a little bit obvious, but to lay them out here, confusion, that's where we can see if we're not prepared and we're flying by the seat of our pants on something, people might be wondering what's going on, who's in charge, who's taking care of what, and it just creates a lot of confusion and question marks on what exactly is going on here and how are we supposed to handle this. That goes hand in hand with a delayed response. When people get hesitant, that increases the likelihood that they might actually lock up and freeze. So that delayed level of care, especially if we're talking about like medical or active violence incidents, something like that, we do want to make sure that that's being handled as quickly as possible. Preventable harm, obviously, if we have a medical incident and nobody knows how to handle it, that might go on longer than it needs to, installing more harm on that individual. Same thing with violence or aggression, or even just a fist fight in the parking lot. If that's not something that's known and thought through of how we're going to handle that, some type of assault or domestic situation or both, How are we going to off ramp that, de-escalate that so it doesn't rise to that level where harm is incurred and it could have been prevented? And at the end of the day, unpreparedness creates that unacceptable risk that at the beginning we need to have that conversation. And that's the whole goal, is to avoid that unacceptable risk and then manage the acceptable. So this ministry of protection, commonly called a safety team. And that's something I really want to hit on, is again, this is a ministry. This is not a hired private security firm. This is where we have the individuals that are able to express their love of people through this work, where they care so deeply about people that they want to ensure their safety and make sure that everything is going well for them, so they have one less thing to worry about. They don't incur harm by coming into your church. That's something that unfortunately we all probably know of a story where somebody came to a church and then they left and never returned because of things that happened to them. And that's a big part of a lot of people's stories. So we want to try to make sure that we delete that part of stories from happening in the future if we're able to. Again, we can't completely delete every level of risk, but we can absolutely minimize some of these horrible things that do happen. It is absolutely mandatory that a church have a safety team, in my opinion. What that looks like may differ. There's different types of teams that, if there's certain restrictions put on by leadership, we'll talk about that a little bit more too. But at least at some level, we do need to have people that are a little bit more prepared, a little bit more clued in to what's going on, and trained and capable of handling incidents as they arise. Again, cohesive with those other ministry teams. We don't want to create that friction and those roadblocks, because that's where a lot of times we see people struggling to get some movement on some good proactive things. And if we're not cohesive and working together, that diminishes the effectiveness of the church as a whole and all the ministry teams to work together. But B, it may very well hinder and handicap the safety team's ability to operate at the level that they want to, and even have access to some of the things they need or want to have access to conduct their safety work. Unsafe environments prohibit community activity. That is very true, especially if you look across the world and some of these different countries and areas that may be not as fortunate as those of us in the United States. If you look at a culture that they fear for their safety every day, they're not able to have these extracurricular activities and large gathering places and worship and events and concerts and all that good stuff, fairs, festivals like we have here very commonly where we're located in the United States here. If we don't have safety as that underpinning foundation, then we're not able to conduct that stuff, because it becomes an unsafe environment, and people are not going to put themselves in unsafe environments when they know that ahead of time. So at the end of the day, safe environments allow communities to flourish. So when that safety is preserved, and especially when we're talking about a church context, if people aren't worried about the safety, they'll continue to attend. If they're not worried about safety as they're attending, they're able to kind of zone into the message a little bit more. And that's just one less thing that has to be on their mind and worried about as they enter that space. Again, it's a ministry. We're really harping on that because it's very important that we don't forget that. We are a church safety team. We're not a hired security firm. So function and culture must reflect Christ, be loving, protective, and have that long-term view. It's very, very easy for some people to be short-sighted and nearsighted and get into, we'll talk about ego and that level of it. But again, really focusing on that servant mindset. How can we best serve these people that are coming into our church and make sure that they're being connected across all the ministries, and especially if there's someone who comes that maybe we have a little bit of suspicion that we need to figure out what exactly is going on, because there is an aspect of wolf in sheep's clothing that we won't get too deep in today, but there are people that come to churches with the intent to victimize people. So we don't want to view everybody through that lens, but we do need to operate in that reality. So that's where, when we talk about long-term view, sometimes that conversation has to be had, that some people either need to grow or go. If they're there and they're essentially creating a rotten apple spoils the bunch situation, then we have to take that big picture view and ask them to make some changes and potentially even step aside for a time. But that's a much deeper conversation there. And then same thing, just making sure that the body as a whole is having the best impact on everybody within it and visitors, and that growth posture where we're able to bring more people into this environment and into this truth of what they need to digest and hear and learn and dive into as a part of being a part of a church and growing in Christ and biblical truths. Impact is positive or negative. Neutrality does not exist in most contexts. So especially when we're talking about our impact as a safety team, we don't have the ability to just kind of be lukewarm, neutral. We do have to understand that whatever we say to people and any actions we take is either going to have a positive or negative reflection on our church, our community, Christ, on those individuals that we're interacting with. And I like to use calories as an example. So anything we put into our mouth food-wise is going to be something that's either going to have a positive or a negative impact on our ability to maintain a certain weight that we want, or gain weight or lose weight. Whatever your goals are, those calories are going to have a positive or negative impact. If your goal is to maintain weight and 2,000 calories will do it for you and stay right at that same healthy, happy weight that you're at, and then eating a 2,500 calorie meal is going to be a negative impact on that goal. Whereas eating, 1,500 calories, if your resting metabolic rate is 2,000 and you're able to lose weight by that calorie deficit, then that's again going to have a positive impact on losing weight. But if you didn't want to lose the weight and you wanted to maintain or you wanted to add weight, then it's going to have a negative impact. So calories are just a good example. I know it's completely off topic. I'm not a nutritionalist. I that is not the world I live in at all here, but it's something that we all have in common and can understand that what we do does have an impact and what we input does impact the output. The loving protector and what that is. So this is going to start taking us into the ministry's identity, the individuals on that team, and that really lays the groundwork because we want to make sure we have the right people on this team and serving in this role. Much as a pastor or a door greeter or a children's ministry worker, we want the right people in the right places in every ministry within the church so that we can have the best impact and the best ability to work with people on their journey. So we want people that are calm, capable, approachable, methodical, knowledgeable, and well-rounded. So there's a lot there, but we'll talk about what I call like a top-tier door greeter with somebody that's capable of responding to active violence as well. But we do want people that are calm and methodical, that can keep a cool head, especially as other people are acting on their emotions and their ego. We want to be able to slow down, take a deep breath, approach the situation in a wise, methodical, knowledgeable sense, but also be well-rounded. So if somebody's a phenomenal speaker, they're good with verbal de-escalation, but they've never touched some of the tools they're planning to use, like AED, firearm, whatever it is, that's not going to be the most beneficial either. We do want to make sure that we're well-rounded, and that's where that training emphasis really comes in. If you have somebody that's of the perfect mindset, perfect heart set, and they're going to be a good fit, and the skills are teachable on the back end, that's going to be a huge focus, is making sure that the mind and the heart are in the right place, and then the skills can follow that in 99% of cases. Most people are very teachable. So again, a little bit of overlap here: loving yet capable, friendly and firm, approachable, ministry-minded, and realities of a broken world without cynicism. So that really goes into that ministry-minded, where we do know that there's good and evil within this world. That doesn't mean that everybody that comes through those doors is a threat to the congregation or to the pastor or to even you. So we don't want to view everybody that comes through our doors as a threat. We want to view them as a visitor, but we are broken people in a broken world. So diagnosing what exactly is going on and making sure that we're connecting the right resources and handling any issues best possible. Top tier door greeters and active violence responders. That is the reality of a safety team. Is at the end of the day, I've heard terms such as enhanced greeters, things like that, but we do need the most friendly, approachable individuals that if they're at the door, good morning, nice to meet you, my name is Tim, thanks for joining us today, haven't met you before, what's your name? And just being that friendly, smiling face where they feel welcome, They understand that there's people there that care about them and are excited to have them in the church. On the flip side of that, the other end of the spectrum is this team's function is to deal with that active violence. So like we see in the news all too often, and that's where kind of backing up to that joke about Tactical Timmy 101 not being what this session is. A lot of times safety teams start because there's something on the news where a lot of people were killed, injured, and hurt. And then the answer goes, well, we need to get guns in church so that we have the good guy with a gun stopping the bad guy with a gun. That is absolutely something that we advocate for, being capable and ready to deal with all the possible threats, especially ones that are more probable, because when we talk about possibility versus probability later, that'll come into play. But this is a very specialized role where we need people that are friendly, approachable, and really want to serve those people well that are coming into the church week after week, but also people that have the skill set, the capability, the mindset to deal with the worst case scenario as well. So it does take a very unique individual, and all individuals on that team need to be on that same page. Now we've got the people. What do we do next? Leadership approval, alignment, check with your insurance company, starting, planning. Those can sometimes go hand in hand. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but structure and refinement are going to be kind of that mid to later stage. So leadership approval and alignment, that is going to be key. If we're not on the same page, again, back to that acceptable versus unacceptable risk, what are we really trying to achieve here? And kind of a disclaimer is if the goal of the safety team is just to get guns in church, and then you're seeing a lot of friction from leadership, that's kind of why, because they need to be educated on the fact that this is a lot bigger picture than just getting firearms in a church to counteract an active shooter. Again, a key component to have there so that in worst case scenarios, we can keep people within those walls safe. But there is a lot of other pieces of that. So we want to make sure that that open dialogue of, hey, this is a holistic safety, proactive team, that we're just making sure that the environment is as void of unacceptable risk as possible. Checking with your insurance company is a great place to start. So some insurance companies will have things outlined where if you have a safety team, you must do X, Y, and Z. Some insurance companies are not very pro-safety teams, so switching companies is an option in those instances. There is a lot of insurance carriers out there, so there's plenty of options. That's that benefit of capitalism there, where if you're not happy with the product that you're currently receiving, you can switch in pretty much all cases. Starting and planning, like I said, those can go hand in hand a little bit because sometimes we see churches get so focused on the policy and the writing and the planning that they never quite get off the starting line. And that's not to pick on those churches. That's just to say that there is a lot to this. It can feel like drinking from a fire hose at the beginning, but the reality is a lot of these established teams that have been around for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, a lot of them started with a couple individuals saying, hey, we're already door greeters. We might as well take some different trainings and classes and be here for situational awareness, de-escalation, responding to any medical incidents or any potential active violence incidents. We just want to take a more holistic look at safety, and we're already here at the church, serving our church, so let's add a little bit more to that. That's how a lot of teams have started. It's just a couple people saying, hey, we want to take this a little bit more seriously. We understand the need for it, and just getting off and running. Now, just walking into church this next weekend and saying you and me are the safety team, that might not be exactly the best plan, because if you're not doing things in certain ways, you may have some legal issues, some liability issues, especially, again, as we talk about like firearms in church and that kind of thing. You want to make sure that you're doing this the right way and in accordance with laws and all that good stuff. Structure is very important. So structure, again, this is kind of that medium range where we do want to get started. We want to have a plan in place. Plans can be refined as they go. We do want to have that good structure, accountability. We'll talk about chain of command a little bit later and why that's important and how that may differ from other contexts versus within a church. And then that refinement. So stagnation is not a good place to be. So once we've built this team, we're improving it, we're continuing on that journey. There is no destination where you have the perfect team. Unfortunately, that's just kind of the nature of it, where things change, environments change, remodels, um, strategies and tactics of individuals wanting to do harm. All these things change over time. Just the culture, society, everything changes. So we have to adopt early on the fact that one of the things that's going to be constant is change. And we're always going to have to try to be up to date and best serving in the modern way that we can. Leadership alignment, I know that was mentioned a little bit earlier, but pastoral oversight is required. At the end of the day, there's people in the church that are in charge, and we have to submit to that authority and that leadership. That doesn't mean we can't make suggestions and give some specialty viewpoints, especially if they differ and maybe have some blind spots on some of their leanings. We want to make sure that we're providing that expert level and that holistic care to the church, congregation, and visitors. Compromises are not losses. So if you're starting a team, have started a team, you're probably not a stranger to some of the friction that can come up in some of these conversations, and compromises are going to be made. There might be some people on the safety end of things, security, military backgrounds, law enforcement backgrounds, that want to basically lock everything down. I know I'm using an extreme example here on both ends, where one of the best ways, ideally on paper, to ensure that nothing bad happens is to essentially treat people like prisoners and make it a prison where everybody goes in their little jail cell, and then they watch on a screen, and everybody's isolated from each other, and there's not going to be any conflict within the people because they're not near each other. We're going to make sure that every single person has a doctor right with them. So if they have any medical issues, somebody's right there. I know this is a pretty far stretch of an example, but we can see some people that are more safety, security, and enforcement minded might be a little bit more keen on some more restrictive things within the church. Whereas on the pastoral end, we can see in extreme examples where people that are more pastoral minded might have the tendency to give everybody the benefit of the doubt, might talk themselves out of things, might see something that's clearly a threat and it's clearly escalating and think that, we're just kind of got to give them the benefit of the doubt. They're having a bad day. They're not going to do what they're saying they're going to do in some cases. So there can be two ends of the spectrum there, and we need to meet in the middle, because we do need to give people some benefit of the doubt. Like I said, not every single person that walks into your church for the first time is a threat. In reality, most are not. It's going to be very few and far between that bad people with bad intentions are on purpose coming to your church for those nefarious intentions. On the flip side, we do want to make sure that it is secure and controlled. Control is not a bad thing. So when we talk about like a hospital environment, it's very controlled. There's monitors, there's plugs, there's security, there's layers, there's doors, there's all these things that make this environment more controlled than just trying to carry out those procedures in a farm field or something like that. This whole process, working with leadership, developing the team, you'll hear this a couple times: marathon, not a sprint. Something to mention there is it's a marathon on a treadmill. It just continues going and going and going and going. It's not exactly 26.2 miles, but it's definitely more of that marathon, not a sprint. So when we think about a marathon, there's a lot of layers there. There's some equipment involved, some nutrition involved, rest involved, all these different components that make marathon a great strategy. Training involved. A lot of people, if they just went out to run a marathon right now, they wouldn't complete it if they haven't been training and that sort of thing. Whereas a sprint, most people are capable of a sprint. That seems a little bit more attainable and ideal, especially in the microwave generation, instant gratification culture. We might want to be tempted to think, oh, let's get this thing started. It's going to be running within a week or two and it's going to be good. The reality is this takes time and it's continually refined over time. That's never ending. Written authority is going to be very important, that we have a defined mission, scope of duties and responsibilities, some limitations, boundaries. We'll talk about the differences between a policy, standard operating procedures, standard operating guidelines, emergency action plans within those. Documentation is important for, again, alignment, accountability, liability, transparency, a whole host of things that make documentation very, very key. Again, like we mentioned early on, we want to avoid confusion. We want to avoid the ability for things to be taken out of context or done in variations that our counter goal and mission focus. Chain of command is very important. We need it to be clear, structured, followed, and still maintaining some autonomy and trust to the team members to make decisions. To a degree, you'll see some examples here. We don't want team members going out and doing things that should go through leadership. But on the day to day, we want people to be confident and understand their scope and their duties and what they are and are not able to do so that they can make those decisions rapidly and quickly. Having this chain of command prevents issues. That too many cooks in the kitchen, that's one of those things. It's a very real thing. So if we get 5 or 6 type A type people in a room and we say, hey, we're going to do this project or this team, we're going to build this thing, you might have some competing opinions. So establishing early on who is kind of the lead and in charge, and again, having that pastoral oversight is very key, and making sure that everything is on the same page and that everybody's working together, not playing tug of war and pulling in different directions. That chain of command really helps on the decision authority. It should be known, and you should have confidence what you can and cannot do, when, why. That comes through not only policy, procedures, guidelines, but also through training. So that's where we get repetitions on those policy, procedures, and goals and plans. And then that builds that confidence and that well-rounded, deep knowledge of what it is we do and why and what our goals are. Some examples where this could come into play is removing somebody. So if we have somebody that's posing a safety risk, a disruption, how far do we go? What do we do? If that person needs to be removed for the safety of everybody else, how does that happen? So that's going to be a policy, training, procedures, guidelines thing that's addressed. Lockdown, if we need to lock the facility down for a whole host of things. We have a known threat in the building, so there's some areas where we're locking the facility down so that that threat can't gain access to that area. Maybe we have a missing kid, so we need a secure perimeter to make sure that we're able to find that kid and figure out what's going on, so that they're not leaving with somebody they're not supposed to be leaving with. Emergency services involvement. If 911 needs to be called, team members should know that they can just do that with a snap judgment, and they need to know when it's appropriate to do all of these things and how to do it, so that it can be more of a muscle memory thing versus trying to figure out on the fly, where I go get a wheelchair, where I go get a mega mover, quick litter, whatever you call it, the first aid kit. A lot of these things need to be known ahead of time and trained and transparent, so that these things can be happening very quickly, rapidly, and real time. Escalation to leadership is another piece of that. That goes back to that to a degree piece of autonomy and trust, where we do want to make sure that people are making decisions when that's the case, but there is pieces of this where we want to bring in that wisdom and that leadership to make sure that we're addressing things best as possible. So especially when there's something that can take a little more time and deliberation and we can slow down, it doesn't need to be dealt with in the next 2 seconds. We do want to make sure that team members know that bringing in leadership is always a good thing. Sometimes we do see organizations where leadership's a little bit more distant and people are a little bit more apprehensive about reaching out. So we do want to break down those barriers and make sure that leadership's involved when appropriate. Everybody answers to somebody. Accountability is a phenomenal thing. It's by design. If we were meant to do this alone, that would be a much less successful ministry, society, you name it. We are community animals as human beings. So part of that is accountability, making sure that lessons that have been learned by other people and other viewpoints that can be brought in, that's a very beneficial piece of all of this. Actions, again, do reflect on Christ and the church. So we do need to be very mindful of what we're doing, why we're doing it, what impacts it has on the ministry and Christianity as a whole. Actions in compliance with P&P. So again, those policies, procedures, guidelines, we do want to make sure that we're in compliance with those, because there's going to be some legal stuff in there. There's going to be some best practice, some liability guards in there. We want to make sure that all of our actions are in compliance with those policy and procedures. We'll talk about some of the best practices in writing those too, so that you're not creating liability with policies that you have. Policy and procedure creates consistency amongst the members of the team, maybe different facets of the team, depending on size. Clarity, again, really making sure that people understand what it is they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they do it. Liability protection for the team member and the church. So the church having some of these things in place, we talked about insurance earlier. So some insurance companies will have guidelines on what they want to see. Some will even offer discounts for having some other things. So again, coming back to that insurance piece is a good starting point, and then a revisiting point later on, annually or every couple of years, seeing what other discounts and liability protections can be taken advantage of within the processes and policies and procedures. What exactly is policy? So now we're going to talk about some differences between a policy manual, a standard operating procedures manual, and standard operating guidelines. So policy really lays out the scope of the role. This is where we talk about requirements, thinking of policy as law. So this might be where we have our shalls and our shall nots. Doesn't need to be in every sentence, but what I mean by that is every individual on this team must have a background check. Every individual on this team shall follow a specific code of conduct, confidentiality statements, and expectations. That's all a part of policy. These are our shalls and shall nots, are non-negotiables. Training, certifications, licenses, etc. Anything that is going to be a hard and fast requirement and doesn't have flexibility would go into policy. Standard operating procedures is where we start seeing a little bit more flexibility. So what I mean by that is these standard operating procedures are going to provide direction. They're not going to be harmful. They're going to be helpful. So that asterisk there, don't handcuff yourself, don't hamstring yourself, don't handicap yourself. What I mean by that is much like on the last slide where we had shalls and shall nots within policy, standard operating procedures are going to be more directional. They're not going to be as specific. We're going to start talking about that gray area, especially when we get into standard operating guidelines. Think of SOPs as the recipe. There might be some slight variations for taste and flavor and that kind of thing, but for the most part, this is giving us a good guide on how to achieve the end result. Produce desirable and repeatable outcomes. So one example here would be activities that variation is the enemy. That's going to be the biggest thing SOPs are addressing. So some examples of that would be expectation, documentation, training, certifications, reporting. Compatibility with other ministry teams is going to be an aspect of standard operating procedures as well. When are we involving children's ministry and children's ministry things? How are we working together in a fire event with children's ministry and other teams? Typical service expectations. This is where we really talk about that variation being the enemy, and SOPs being a good area to address those things. So before a church service, who, how, when, and what time are people going to go around and check locked doors and make sure that anything that could be a safety hazard is addressed early on if possible, like an unlocked, unsecured door, or maybe even something structural or something's fallen over. Maybe something got broke during youth activities or something that needs to be fixed so somebody doesn't, snag their arm on it and get a cut or whatever. So that's all things that can be addressed in our SOPs is what are we doing before the service starts? What are we doing after, like lockup procedures, getting radios back on the charger, that kind of stuff, addressing all of that in SOPs. Thinking about even some of the small things like what time should they be there? So if service is at 9:00, do we want people rolling in at 9:01 that are on the safety team? Do we want them there at 8:59? Do we want them there at 8:30, 8:15, 8:00? So do they need to be 2 hours early? That is going to be very specific to each church and what their expectations and goals and really part of that's going to be like facility size, team size, and how much do you have to do with how much horsepower do you have to do it with? So pre and post incidents, same thing. So before an incident ever happens, have we made sure that we've got proper stock in the medical kit, AEDs in functioning order, fire extinguishers are good to go. Doors might be pre-locked in the children's wing where the lock is engaged, but the door is open. All that needs to be done is close the door, and then the classroom is locked down. So those are some things that can happen pre-incident, post-incident. That's where we talk about like reporting and care and connection of resources. We'll talk about that again in a little bit. But again, all of this SOP, SOG stuff is going to be very specific to each church and organization. Routine SOP examples, like I mentioned, would be how the team is posted, when they're getting there, what they're doing. But on how the team is posted, you might have some spots where it's good to just have somebody there, maybe standing, sitting, walking back and forth, that kind of thing. There might be some posts that make the most sense to be a static post, rovers, floaters, whatever you want to call them, having those defined of, maybe for example, we might have somebody posted at entrance A, B, the children's wing, a rover. If you don't have enough people or your facility's huge, I would recommend, we'll talk about recruitment and that kind of thing and having a healthy roster. But it's very likely that some of these spots you might stand near the front entrances as people are coming and going. But once the service is going and there's nobody really coming and going, maybe you're kind of watching a couple different entrances, floating between the two. If you have the horsepower to not do that, then you might as well have somebody static there. So you've got dedicated people. But the reality is most teams do sometimes struggle for people, especially early on. So you might have to make best do with what you have to some degree. If that's the case, having areas of responsibility, or maybe there's a couple people in the sanctuary, a couple people in the foyer, somebody that can float through the parking lot periodically. Again, very dependent on environment, layout, team size, structure, all that good stuff. Roles, structure, and function. So we may have people that are just strictly security, medical, or observers. When I say just strictly, that is very, very loose. That's most likely going to be their specialty. But again, that multi-tool, multifaceted mentality, where if we have people with especially specific training and backgrounds that are lean a little bit heavier toward the security aspect, same thing with medical. If you have nurses, doctors, paramedics, and those people are able to kind of take point on some of those incidents, same thing on the security side, use the best resources, leverage your people. So whatever somebody's specialty is, we want to leverage that specialty. So again, we're achieving the best possible results. Observers are key as well. So sometimes when churches start thinking that everybody needs to be armed and it's just a solution of getting guns in church to solve the problem, that's really not the case. It's a lot easier to intervene in something early if it's been observed, we've oriented toward it, and then we can make that decision and act upon the data. Written guidelines, principles, decision criteria, boundaries. This is within our standard operating guidelines. So this really gets a lot more vague than SOPs. So again, like principles, concepts, in theory type stuff, decision criteria. There's some legal verbiage that can be used. We'll talk about getting an attorney involved in some of this written process and resources, boundaries, lines that people shouldn't cross, when to involve higher levels of care and that kind of stuff. Not spending above your pay grade is kind of a good example there. Leave room for judgment though. So recognize the need for flexibility in dynamic situations. SOGs are best used to address those "it depends" responses. So what would we do if XYZ happened? If the best answer is it depends, you change one variable and the whole scenario kind of flips, that's where SOGs are going to come into play. So within our response SOGs, what happens during incidents, emergency action plans are going to come into play, the goals of why we're doing what we're doing, intentionally vague. So especially talking about like use of force and that kind of thing, but really any actions that we take, we want them to be objectively reasonable based on the totality of the circumstances and what was known at the time. So this is where you can bring in some verbiage from laws, case law, that kind of stuff, and really integrate that into your guidelines and policies, because at the end of the day, we need to have guidelines that are in line with legal actions. Ideal roles and actions. This is where we're going to talk in SOGs about contact cover principles, where if we have somebody that just needs to be talked to, we don't need 5 people surrounding them and listening and viewing them with that level of just skepticism. So again, we want to make sure that things are being handled and controlled responsibly and that we're promoting that safe environment, but that we're not turning people away that are just there to visit and maybe some of their actions are just unknown versus an issue. De-escalation, again, verbal is really what we start to think about with this. If we've got somebody that's amped up, they're operating on emotion, ego, that kind of thing, and they're really looking to have an argument, not a discussion, we want to make sure that we're off ramping as much as possible, and de-escalation is pretty much always the goal. So if we have a medical incident and everything's escalated medically, safety wise, by taking certain actions like initiating high quality CPR, stabilizing blood sugar, that kind of stuff, that de-escalates that situation because some other components of that could be family that's worked up. By providing care, that de-escalates those family members. If we have an active violence situation, it has been escalated to just about the highest level. So how do we bring that back down? When we talk about active violence, it's never going to be something that we hope for. It's not going to be pretty, but de-escalating an active violence incident is likely going to involve a good person combating a threat and bringing that back down to a safe level. Of course, there's going to likely be some harm that occurs, but we want to get that to stop as quick as possible. So especially when we talk about active violence that's utilizing a firearm, we want to stop the killing and then stop the dying. And that's really getting a little bit more into some training principles and things like that. But standard operating guidelines really give us a good picture of what are some ideal things we're wanting to achieve, and then what are some best practices to achieve those goals, such as like rendering aid, that kind of stuff, relying on training, contacting emergency services, getting more resources on the way, and those higher levels of care and expertise headed your way to help out with incidents. So standard operating procedures post-incident, this is where we can address things like documentation. Again, we don't want variation when it comes to SOPs. That's where SOPs shine. They address those things that we don't want variation. So if we have some type of incident, whether it's a little bit more severe or even just a trip and fall, documenting that. So thinking about your documentation process, is it going to be paper? Is it going to be digital? How are records going to be maintained? Who has access? All that good stuff can be addressed through SOPs. Debriefing, having it a good standard practice that anytime you have an incident, you're debriefing as a team, you're learning lessons on what went well, what could have been done better. Because at the end of the day, anytime we encounter a challenge, you're essentially paying some tax on that. So if you handle something and maybe it wasn't handled quite the way you'd like, you've kind of paid that tax. And so how can we share that with the team to not pay the same taxes over and over and over and over? Care, that's where I want to bring up connection of resources again, making sure that if we do have something happen, like little Susie trips and falls, hits her head, ambulance winds up showing up, that can be a very stressful incident for the family. So, midweek, do we have somebody on the hospitality team reaching out, helping them with whatever they can, connecting those resources, getting the prayer team involved, so we're extending prayer to those people that have encountered stressful stuff within the worship space, just making sure that we're taking a good holistic view and addressing a lot of that within our SOPs of things that, like in that instance, it kind of can serve as a checklist where, we've had an incident. What exactly needs to happen after this? Oh, I need to document it. We need to schedule a debrief, and we need to make sure that care is lined up for all those involved. Review cycle on SOPs and SOGs at a minimum annually, but then post-incident updates. So whenever you have an incident and you think, man, I wish we would have done something a little differently there, that's a good time to sit down and review those procedures and guidelines. Attorney review, I know this is the part where money's not free, doesn't grow on trees as much as we all wish maybe that it did. One thing to think about, I'm not an attorney. I don't have any, commissions coming my way from saying this, but attorneys are the professionals when it comes to liability and mitigation and that kind of stuff and interpreting laws. And like I said at the beginning, not giving legal advice here. That's what attorneys are for. They, in a lot of incidents, are much, much cheaper than a lawsuit. Um, an attorney that I once heard say, you can either pay me now or you can pay me later. That's a very true statement. Again, I know attorneys are expensive, but it's an investment. Don't think of getting that attorney review as so much of a cost or a liability. It's an asset and an investment because it's going to long term pay dividends and put some legal protections in place. We'll talk about a couple different types of policy, emergency action plans, and that kind of stuff. One of which being a light use of force talk here on in terms of policy, because this comes up a lot. You'll see firearms coming up in a second here, because these are things that can be huge question marks. So in terms of use of force policy, we do want to make sure that everything we're doing is lawful and like I said earlier, objectively reasonable based on the totality of the circumstances and within training, really talking about what all that means and having those deep levels of understanding of lawful action and scope and what can and can't be done in terms of use of force. And when you think about use of force, we're not just talking about a firearm or a knife or something like that. You can be talking about physical force as well. So one example I like to think through is posing the question up front, what do you do if somebody has a knife? How do you deal with that? Well, just like pretty much all things use of force, the best answer is it depends. What are the totality of the circumstances? Is this an individual that's making threats and on the path to do harm? Or is this a little kid that just picked up a knife out of the kitchen and is on their way to open up a cheese stick, a bag of animal crackers, or something like that? Um, in that instance, if we have a safety hazard for that child that went and found a knife in the kitchen or something like that, there's kind of a lot there where could we make sure that doesn't happen? But just kind of talking through this on its face, where is it reasonable to gently, reasonably remove that knife from that kid's hand? Yeah, I think most people would agree with that. But again, objectively reasonable based on the totality of the circumstances. So if an individual that is a little bit more capable in making threats, that's going to be dealt with very differently than a little kid that has that knife. So some of those gotcha questions can be a little bit dangerous because they try to oversimplify the dynamic and complicated nature of use of force because it is very, very dependent and changes once you change the variables, and they're not super repeatable. So no two incidents are very likely to be identical. That's going to be very, very few and far between. So everything is going to have slight differences based on who's involved, the environment, and all the things at play. Again, that totality of the circumstances. So there is going to be some redundancy through the policy, the SOPs, SOGs, training, emergency action plans. That's not a bad thing. So just because it's redundant, again, those are just layers, and that is a good thing. Much like use of force, firearms policy comes up a lot. So this is, again, not going to be the whole picture here. This is a short session, but strict standards. So within this policy, we want to make sure that we're addressing a lot of things. Here's just a couple examples. Having a qualification and maintain proficiency. So what is a firearms qualification? It's an evaluation. So qualification is where we test proficiency and we have a standard of proficiency that must be maintained. So if we have a designated course of fire, maybe you copy what the law enforcement in your area is doing. I think that's a good best practice because then you're not just making things up on your own, utilizing those systems that are proven and work, like a law enforcement qualification would be a great example. The bullet point here, specific brands, that's really meant to draw out the question of, do we have equipment standards? So do we want somebody carrying a flintlock from way back when, that kind of thing? Or do we want reputable, functional type firearms that are being carried and potentially utilized if needed? making sure that the equipment is up to a certain standard. Now, specific brands and makes, models, that kind of stuff can be a little bit more personal to some people because it's highly preferential. When it comes to firearms, I like to joke that there's 5 million options, 2.5 million are good on paper, and one's going to work best for you. But there are some options that are just not a good option. So, having that up front that, maybe here's our list, be a very long list of things that we're willing to see as equipment as it pertains to firearms. So the firearm selection itself, that can be a little more sticky. And again, going to be highly based on preference and situational and um, selected by each specific church and team. But holsters can be a little bit more black and white. So most churches are not open carrying. So that brings us to concealed carry holsters, whether it's inside the waistband on the hip or appendix carry or even outside the waistband, but in a holster that keeps it real snug to the body so it's not seen. We'll talk about appearance and that kind of stuff here in a minute, but holsters are one of those things you can be a little more black and white on. So making sure that it's a rigid holster so that it's protecting that trigger guard, like Kydex or plastic or something like that, that's going to be hard, and make sure that that holster is retaining that firearm and making it so that the trigger can't be manipulated by leaning on a table or sitting down or something like that. So that one's a little bit simpler. Ammo requirements, really making sure that everybody on the team is carrying hollow points, making sure that we don't have full metal jacket rounds in those firearms. So as you can see with firearms policy, the main thing here is we're making sure that we have good equipment, that everybody's on the same page in what the expectations are on what they're carrying. But along with that, is everybody a good fit? So discretion is going to be highly required here. Like I said earlier on in the session, not everybody is going to be a perfect fit for this role, much like not everybody's going to be a perfect fit to be a pastor or a perfect fit to work with kids. Within any type of ministry team or just teams in general, there's going to be certain people that are good fits and certain people that aren't, and that needs to be defined by you and your team. What's going to be a good fit? We'll talk about that a little bit more too. But as it pertains to like qualification, efficiency standards, that kind of stuff, something I really want to state here is that team members do tend to rise or sink to the standards. So whatever standards you set, that's going to be that baseline. Much like I talked about timeliness earlier on, if you say be there at 9:00, you're going to have some variation where some people are going to be 5, 10, 15 minutes early. Some people are going to be 5, 10, 15 minutes late because it's been left open for interpretation. Whereas when we have that standard of be 15 minutes early, now we have something that is enforceable. It's for good reason, so that we're making sure we're prepared and we're not flustered coming in late, that kind of stuff. Same thing here, where when you have people on the team that all have trust in each other, faith in their proficiency, their skill set, their equipment, we're not viewing each other as like safety hazards and all these question marks of, what does so-and-so do? How do they do it? We're flushing all of that early on so that we're not having all those unanswered questions. Appearance policy, this is not to talk about man buns and beards and that kind of stuff. We're really talking about a professional appearance. So avoiding a few things. If everybody in your church is wearing shorts and a t-shirt, it's not going to make sense to be in a suit and tie and or even like duty gear with a vest and belt and open carry, that kind of stuff. So we do want to achieve that good, capable appearance, but also not be intimidating and overbearing and out of place. I like to suggest that we blend with the congregation as best as possible. So what that means is going to look a lot different from church to church. But think about things such as identification, uniform. What I mean by uniform is if everybody in the church is wearing a suit and tie, then maybe jeans and cargo pants aren't going to be a good fit. Likewise, if everybody's wearing jeans and cargo pants, putting everybody on the safety team in a suit and tie or more of a duty style uniform might not be the best role. That's, again, going to be highly subjective. There are teams that are utilizing all ends of the spectrum and doing it well, and it's what works for their church and their goals and their scope of what it is they want to do and how they want to do it. So that's going to be very subjective. Um, but I like to suggest some type of identification. So if most of your ministry teams are wearing some type of name tag or a lanyard or something like that, let's just say, for example, if your hospitality team that, serving coffee and holding the doors open, that kind of stuff, if they have an orange name tag and the children's wing has a yellow name tag, maybe you could have a blue name tag or something like that, where it doesn't necessarily have to say anything on it other than your name and maybe a photo. It can be very simple. It can be a piece of paper and a little pouch that identifies, your name and that you're with XYZ church. Um, it could be a little bit more complex where maybe it's just a polo shirt with the church's logo on it. If you wanted to throw safety on there or something like that, that's going to be very much up to you and up to the church and leadership. But having some kind of identification can be very beneficial. Also, having components of the team that maybe aren't identified, that are there to help and aren't wearing that identification that day, that's going to come down to, again, SOPs and how you're going to have people. Policy enforcement, equal application. I like to say no homie hookups. So if Tim is your best bud and he's kind of slacking on some of the requirements, he's not showing up on time, he's not able to, meet the standards in terms of certifications and qualifications and that kind of stuff, because he's let those slide over time. We really can't be making those exceptions. Again, people either rise or fall to the standards. So the standards you set are going to be very, very important, and the standards you maintain are going to be equally, if not more important. Consistency is key there. Like I said, on the whole no homie hookups thing, we don't want our buddies getting free passes, because that can really dip morale. People see that. And it's just one of those things that we want to make sure that this culture is maintained. We'll talk about culture a little bit further here in a couple minutes, but the goal is to grow, not alienate. So another thing I like to mention, kind of like homie hookups, good old boys clubs. That is something that can be very, very detrimental. So much like we don't want the safety team to be separate from all the other ministry teams, we want that good cohesion. Same thing within the team. So if we've got a group of individuals that sees a newcomer coming onto the team, we want to make every effort to bring that person in, help them grow, integrate them into the team. That whole culture of having to gain access, that can be a huge hindrance, where if people come onto the team, they don't feel like people really want them there. You might lose somebody that could be a huge asset, when you could have just worked with them a little bit, brought them in, and helped them gel into that team culture. So emergency action plans here. Again, this is kind of going back to some of the SOGs, SOPs stuff, but emergency action plans are going to be a part of that. So what are these? This is where we address like who, what, when, where, who is doing things in a situation. Again, highly fluid and situationally dependent. So there's going to be a lot of like it depends type verbiage in there. What are they doing? This could be direct involvement or a support role. So if we have something medical going on and we've got maybe 10 people, for example, that are on the safety team and are present that day, we most likely don't need all 10 people, getting juice and getting blood sugar fixed, or, just different types of examples, slip and fall, head hit, they lost consciousness and now they're back conscious and stable. A couple people can stay with that individual. Then when the ambulance is on the way, again, that example of having 10 people, somebody could go meet the ambulance and say, hey, I'll bring you right to where they're at. That way we're being efficient. We're getting the resources where they need to go as quickly and efficiently as possible. When are some of these actions happening? So one verbiage example would be when safe to do so. So if we're thinking about there's a violent act and we need to stop the harm, then provide aid. So stopping the harm and then stopping the harm from festering and continuing to get worse. So active violence example, that's carried out with a firearm. Again, we want to stop the killing. And then once that killing has been stopped and that threat has been turned into no longer a threat, that's where we want to then look at making sure that we maintain their inability to be a threat, and then also address those that were wounded, so they don't bleed out and sustain further harm. Things like that. Where, again, very situational, can refer to action. It can refer to, if we have something medical going on, do we want to get that person to a specific location? Do we want to remove them from the sanctuary if possible? Like I referenced earlier, mega movers, quick litters, wheelchairs, things that can move people. So one example might be if somebody during worship, lock their knees, they lose consciousness, but now they're back, but they don't really know exactly what happened. That might be appropriate to get them into a wheelchair, get them out, do a little bit more evaluation, get some more resources involved. Whereas if we have somebody that is unconscious and we want to move them out of the sanctuary so we have more room and ability to better care, and then some space for when EMS gets there and they want to bring all of their tools in, that's where it's going to be very dependent, because if we have somebody that's unconscious, it's not likely that we're going to want to put them in a wheelchair. Again, I'm being a little vague here because training is going to be a much deeper dive than this. That's just something to think about, is it's going to be very situational and dependent on exactly what's going on, where it's going on, and what the totality of the circumstances is. Another piece of the where might be even directing people, like when we think about fire, directing people to exits, that kind of stuff. So who, what, when, and where are we doing? Fire EAP example. So this is just one example. There can be many examples of emergency action plans, but thinking about fire, how are we going to navigate that? So fire alarms are going off. If that's the case, verification. Now, if we're seeing flames, seeing smoke, that kind of stuff, that verification process is going to be very, very quick. But once we've verified that there actually is a safety hazard, that's when we're working on evacuation and 911. Those are going to be going kind of together, where we're delegating, hey, you call 911, and then we're getting people out as quickly and efficiently as possible. Still maintaining accountability, though, so we don't want kids just zipping off into the grass and the woods. We also don't want parents going and grabbing their kids, and then at the end of all of this, when the dust settles, we have that check-in, check-out procedure, and we're trying to figure out where kids went. We're not sure if their parents picked them up or if they wandered off. So that is going to be very, very important that we maintain that accountability and that control, and that we do have a reunification plan. So if we're evacuating to a specific point on the property or on a neighboring property, making sure that we're getting the right kids to the right parents, and the person that dropped them off is going to be key there, and that we're not unsure of whether or not people got back with who they're supposed to be with. Documenting all this stuff. So again, that's going to be pretty much any incident. We're going to be making sure that that's well documented and laid out exactly what we want in that documentation. Weather, this is going to be another one. It depends on the insurance company, but this can be one that can get you some discounts with some companies and things like that. Not that that's always the goal here, but just a side added benefit on top of safety. Storms, power outages, earthquakes, hurricanes, depending on where you are. We're in a northern state. Hurricanes are not a thing here. So didn't mention hurricanes, but on hurricanes and earthquakes, focus on probability versus possibility. If you're on fault lines and earthquakes are a regular thing, that's going to take some more priority versus like the state we're located in. Earthquakes don't collapse buildings here, at least at this point. So it's not something that is going to be a huge focal point. Again, just that probability versus possibility. Is it possible that you have a historic first time ever earthquake in a place that doesn't generally have earthquakes? Yes, it's possible. It's just not very probable. Storms and being up to date on that kind of stuff. So for example, Tornado Alley can shift. We've seen over time that states that didn't historically have a lot of tornadoes maybe now do, or ones that had a lot maybe don't have them as much. So knowing really what the possible and probable things are that can happen in your area and dealing with that. Power outages, that can be another piece of this. And really thinking about programming considerations based on severe weather. So if we have severe weather, what are we going to do? What are going to be our steps for a tornado, um, ice storm event, ice, snow, sleet, hail, having processes in place. So if we've got youth group and all the schools were canceled because the roads are dangerous, thinking about that, a lot of those youth group attendees, especially high school age, might be driving there. So we do want to make sure that we're being responsible in terms of making the tough call to cancel programming sometimes for the sake of safety in terms of like weather and that kind of stuff. Violence obviously is something we've talked about throughout here. So that active violence, this is going to be again a huge. It depends objective reasonableness based on the totality of the circumstances, but actions are going to be highly situational, a blend of being addressed in policy, SOPs, SOGs, emergency action plan, training. This is going to be where we really want to know what our goals are. So when it comes to active violence, our goals are to deter it in the first place, where that's a huge component of this team is if we have people that are visible, people that are aware of what's going on, and they're able to act on some of that early through the deterrence and detection, then they have the ability to delay that action and those intents, moving on up to the denial, where if we're able to not have that person on property or even not have that person entering the building or contained within a certain piece of the building so they don't have access to the sanctuary, like in a foyer area, as we're figuring out, um, you know, what all's going on here. If it's a lot more obvious, then that denial is going to look a lot different. And then obviously defending if active violent acts are being carried out, defending yourself and others against the harm that's going to come from that. Another emergency action plan example could be a missing child. So, lockdown, information gathering, search involving law enforcement, documentation. So, one example I would give on information gathering was an incident that I seen where mom came up to safety team, said, "We're looking for our son who is missing. He's short, blonde, short hair." Turns out the person she was speaking to, the kid was actually taller than her, had longer hair than him, and looked a little bit different than his mental picture was. So, as we're gathering information, some easy ways to fact check that with kids. Again, taking the extra couple seconds to say, "Hey, can you show me a picture?" Because if we're looking for the wrong kid from the get-go, it's not going to be faster to look for the wrong kid. So if we can take a second and say, "Hey, show me a photo of your son or daughter that we're looking for," then you have a good view of who it is you're looking for. If you can get a copy of that picture quick, snapping a photo on the cell phone, and then the individuals that are helping look, a quick text to make sure we're all looking for the same person, and then having a good perimeter, locking down if appropriate, if it's at that level, where we're making sure that if this kid has been taken, that anybody that comes or goes from the property, we're aware of that and making sure that the kid is with who they're supposed to be with. And if they're lost, making sure that they're found and they leave with their parents. So that search is going to be where we're looking for them, obviously, involving law enforcement, especially as we're getting to that point where it's like, this is not good. Maybe it's something where somebody saw the kid leave the property or saw them leave with somebody else. We're going to want to make sure we get law enforcement involved as quickly as possible when appropriate. Now, if this is a kid that's just upstairs or kind of moved out of sight and we're able to find them quickly, then law enforcement's not likely going to need to arrive on scene for something like that. But if it's a little more severe, we absolutely want to make sure that law enforcement's being involved. And in all these cases, again, documenting. Making sure our emergency action plans are simple, plain language, helpful, not confusing. Again, back to that earlier statement of making sure that we're not giving ourselves unneeded barriers and roadblocks and that kind of stuff. We want to make sure that they're simple yet effective. So coming back to some of that chain of command governance structure discussion that was had earlier on in the session here, I'm a big fan of having a board. It doesn't need to be in a boardroom with big chairs and that kind of stuff, but having somebody that's in charge, and then people that are on that governing board. So having a pastoral staff member on that board a safety director. Like when I say somebody in charge, I'm specifically talking about the safety team, but this board's going to oversee that team and that leader. So having this board that is a good place for oversight and direction and accountability, but members of that being a pastoral staff member, a safety team director, these verbiages can change. They don't have to be exactly, a safety team director, but safety director, team leads, and then team members. So in a world of AI and fancy software, yes, I got Microsoft Paint out there to get those up and down arrows. That's to symbolize that we do need that open door policy to a degree where team members are able to communicate up and down the chain as needed. We'll talk about some examples of where chain of command is very important, though. The safety director's role primarily, and there's going to be some differences here, but we want somebody that's in charge of oversight of the team within the team, and then overseeing it, providing direction, vision on training, goals, and how we're doing what we're doing and why we're refining that, really taking the charge on making sure things are being refined and structured and done so in a methodical, diligent way. Communication up and down the chain, where the safety director is in touch with those that are serving Sunday to Sunday, but also in touch with pastoral leadership and making sure that everybody's on the same page and we have that good cohesion. Team lead's role is going to be more of a supervision role, thinking of the safety director as more of a management level, and the team lead as more of a supervisory level. They're really responsible for making sure that, mentorship, they're really in touch with the concerns of the team and they're able to bring that up to higher levels of leadership and have some more of that higher level, deeper discussion on some fundamental changes and that kind of stuff. Team members' roles, I don't mean to oversimplify this too much, but a lot of their role is going to be to observe what's going on, orientate themselves to that data and that information, decide on the things that they've observed and orientated themselves to, and then act upon that in their decision. Lawfully and reasonably intervening within scope, policies, SOPs, SOGs, and their training, making sure that documentation is done and all those policy SOPs and legal obligations are in place with really everything they're doing. Resource connection again. So if we have somebody that maybe was upset and they're de-escalated, and then we're able to give some further resources of like a Bible study or something like that, that's where team members should be able to just make that call right away and say, hey, I know who, you should talk with this person, or I'm going to give this individual your name and number so they can reach out. It's going to be, again, dependent, but these are really your boots on the ground, serving Sunday to Sunday, people that are on the team, and then communicating with leadership as needed. So small teams may have less layers on paper, but more multi-tools. So when we talk about span of control, we do want to make sure that the proper channels are being utilized. Again, back to that chain of command. That's where, especially with large teams, they tend to be a little bit more segmented, but unity must remain, must have that good ability to have that decision-making authority, as well as that maintenance of chain of command. And some of the reasons why on that is if pastoral leadership is, out in the foyer greeting new people as they're coming, that's not going to be the time for a team member to approach them and say, hey, we would really love to see the purchase of some new equipment. That's something they can bring up to their team lead, and then their team lead can pass it along, because that's obviously not going to happen right that second. So it's not something that we need to bring up and discuss right there. So that'd be an example of where that chain of command is going to be good and help maintain that unity and that cohesion, but also making sure that we have delegation of specialties. So within larger teams, you're going to have more resources, more people, more horsepower. So you might be able to break out into like a medical component, observation component, administrative tasks. Those can be a big thing where, as the team grows and as trainings are scheduled and certifications and the expiration of those and all that stuff needs to be maintained. If you have some people that are great at the administrative stuff, leverage those skill sets. Same thing with observation. If you have people that don't carry a firearm, and not everybody needs to. There is a huge benefit to having observers and more eyes and more layers on that where people can detect things early and de-escalate and use those verbal skills and medical skills and that kind of stuff. You may be able to break down into a observation team, a medical team, more of a security element. Totally depends. But especially if you're a much smaller team with like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people, that might make a lot more sense where everybody's kind of going to be having to do a lot of things. And again, more of that multi-tool role because you just don't have the people to specialize as much as a larger team might. Rotation relief is going to be very important because burnout can be a huge problem in the long term scheme of a team like this in any ministry in general. We see that across all ministries where people do good work for a long time and they can get burnt out. Some of that can come down to schedule, especially in like a safety team like this. You should have the benefit of having a healthy, adequate roster where you have people that can rotate. They're not serving every single service every single weekend because that's where you see the quickest path to burnout is if we have people that are serving in a safety role and they're not attending service regularly. They might start feeling like this is just a part-time job and not being able to be as effective as possible. Adequate roster, that is again very important to that. Along with schedule, where we have a good rotation of when they serve, when they train. Just like serving every week can be a problem, training every day is not going to be a reality either. So we'll talk about some training cadence suggestions here in a second. Delegation is going to be a huge piece here. Whenever you see a safety team that one person is taking the lead on pretty much everything, that's where it's going to be very likely that that individual is going to get burnt out, tired, fatigued, and then you might see some things slipping and some gaps kind of expanding. So delegation, again, really helps with that spreading the load, spreading some of that burden that does exist because there is work involved in this, but also enhances that accountability and that oversight as well. So delegation is going to be very, very key. Boundaries, making sure that, again, people aren't over-investing, over-exerting, that we're putting some good, healthy boundaries in place, that we're not just putting all the load on just a couple people. Culture is highly, highly important. Please do not overlook culture. That is something that can absolutely make or break a team. If we have a culture that is just full of cynicism, negativity, complaining, that kind of stuff, that can erode not only the team itself, but the other ministry teams' view of that team and their trust in that team. So culture is going to be a huge component here where we want to make sure that back to that loving protector discussion at the beginning, that people are calm, methodical, their heart's in the right place. They're doing this out of a deep love of people. They're not getting their egos or their status or any of that involved. So culture is highly, highly important. Again, accountability, that growth mindset, making sure that this is a environment where people are in this to be better servants and better serve their church congregation and community. Ego, as I mentioned a second ago, can be a huge problem. Sometimes we see people with certain backgrounds, whether it's military, law enforcement, emergency services, medical, emergency management. Those backgrounds are all phenomenal. Sometimes we see people come in that think they're a little bit more of an individual that can do this on their own, but that's not the reality. That's why there's a team. We need people that can be humble, disciplined, do all of this with integrity and professionalism, like I mentioned earlier on. Treat everybody with dignity and respect, regardless of circumstance. Everybody that comes into interaction with a member of the team, with the church, needs to be treated with that love, dignity, and respect. Lone wolves can be very catastrophic, so we do want to make sure that everybody on the team understands this is a team and we're doing this for the church and the team and those within the church and within the team. So that lone wolf mentality and that egotistical, ego-driven thought that some people have as they approach this team, that needs to be nipped in the bud very early on. Which really brings us to iron sharpens iron. I love this saying. It's something that it's a good masculine saying that kind of makes people puff their chest sometimes, that absolutely iron does sharpen iron. But I think something that we need to address with the iron sharpening iron process is if we think about sharpening a knife or a blade, whatever it is, it could be your lawnmower blade, your pocket knife, whatever it is. Whenever something's being sharpened, that is a process that's going to produce a more effective, beautiful, properly functioning tool on the back end. But that refinement process is not always comfortable. So if you think about that sharpening process, if the blades become dulled, it's got some chips, some burrs, that kind of thing, as it's being sharpened, pieces of that metal are being lost, burrs are being knocked down. There's kind of a level of violence within that and aggression that is, again, healthy for the effectiveness of that tool. So this iron sharpens iron mentality is a very good thing. The whole point is to refine and restore that beauty and the true nature of what that tool was meant to be. So some pieces of that to make sure that we're constantly refining ourselves, our team members, and everybody within it is that fellowship. So sometimes teams can get a little bit wrapped up in what they're doing and not who they're doing it with. So training is very important, but also that community side is very important as well. So if you have training scheduled, I would suggest also having even like, some bonfires, campouts, holiday parties, that kind of stuff. Building that fellowship and that community within the team is going to go a very long way in terms of the effectiveness and the ability to serve well. Accountability, we've hit on several times here, but that's a part of that refinement process here. That's not to pick on people, to, instill guilt or any of that. It's, hey, this is what I see happening or saw happen. And if we, make some adjustments and correction, it's going to be better for everybody involved. Again, spreading that load, making sure that this isn't all riding on one person's shoulders, and really having that improvement posture. Never fully trained is something that really needs to be taken to heart with this. I know I've mentioned sometimes people with backgrounds can have some different leanings. One of the things I like to suggest is what you've done is absolutely something to be respected and appreciated, and it brings a ton of value and wisdom. But if you have somebody that thinks they're fully trained because, they had a lot of experiences and training 20 years ago, the reality is that landscapes, environments, strategy, all that stuff changes over time. So we need to stay up to date with that. So I like to think of that is if you're fully capable of using all the technology of today and you never adapt and adopt the new technologies and the new methodologies, that makes me think that, if you applied that to every area of life in the modern age, you'd still be on a typewriter, you wouldn't have a cell phone, that kind of stuff. So we do need to understand that this level of training is again, a marathon, not a sprint, with that marathon really being conducted on a treadmill and there's no mile number put on that. It's just this long-term endurance endeavor. It's not going to be a quick sprint to the finish line. Training is absolutely required, so skills are highly perishable, especially as we talk about some of these medical proficiencies, defensive proficiencies, whether it's in defensive tactics or utilization of firearms, that kind of stuff. Firearms specifically, if we talk about that again for a second, if you have an armed component of your team and you have people that are carrying and they haven't maintained proficiency in months with that platform, you can see very quickly that those skills degrade and are perishable. Individual training is going to be key too. That's something that I've heard mentioned in police academies, is that unfortunately, if you want to be a standout in your role, you're going to have to seek some of that training on your own. That's kind of the reality with most things though. You're just not going to be able to provide each individual an individualized approach to their training capabilities, skill set, and proficiency. Each individual is going to have to do some homework and some legwork on their own to make sure that they're maintaining those standards. but also having those team trainings where everybody comes together. So again, not having the lone wolf that's just doing all this stuff on their own and not integrating that in with the team. We do have to have that team cohesion and compatibility. Feedback and input's going to be a key part of training. So if you have one person that does all the training for the team, getting some different viewpoints, some different perspectives, that's going to be very, very vital, so that you don't get into that echo chamber mentality and just do things one person's way. Having those multiple viewpoints, but still within that span of control and that chain of command is going to be very, very vital. A suggested training cadence here, is this the perfect solution? No, but one of the big things is just approach this with a plan and intention, much like a lot of things we've been discussing throughout this session. So my suggestion would be having monthly trainings. These can be on the micro level. And again, this is going to be very dependent on what you're able to do, and this can expand over time. My suggestion would be having monthly trainings. If you're not having monthly trainings at this point, start with, again, like I said, micro trainings. This can be 20 to 30 minutes in between services. If you only have one service, maybe it's a half hour before service or a half hour after. Monthly, where you're going through incidents that have occurred, things that went well, things that didn't. If you haven't had any incidents at your church, maybe you look at some neighboring churches, look at some news articles. There's a plethora of ways to find some things that we can learn from. Again, like I mentioned earlier, if somebody else has paid the tax on something and we can learn from that without having to pay that tax ourselves, that's going to be very, very important that we take advantage of that. So monthly trainings achieve a lot of things where that information is constantly being digested and disseminated and discussed. This gives people opportunities to make suggestions and bring up concerns, even things as simple as issues with equipment, radios, that kind of thing, where if we have this monthly opportunity to discuss what's working and what's not, then we can address those things so they don't fester and build over time. Quarterly trainings, this is where we talk about like qualifications and scenarios. Those to me make the most sense, because if you have an armed component of your team, you're going to want to make sure that those qualifications are being conducted at least twice a year, that everybody's qualifying. That's a good standard, so that you're not going a full year without making sure that those proficiency levels are being maintained. So one thing, again, to note on qualifications is that's an evaluation. I don't view a qualification as training personally. So a qualification is going to be that evaluation to make sure that proficiency is being maintained. So a good example of a qualification would be if you select a course of fire qualification that works well for you and your team, conduct that. It's probably not going to take much time. And then after that qualification has been passed and conducted, that's when then on the range you can run drills and actually do some training. Scenarios are another good thing to do twice a year. So that's where you get your 4 quarters there. Twice a year, having some type of scenarios where the team is running through as team members, and then, other team members or volunteers can be role players, so that you can actually work through de-escalation scenarios, medical scenarios on dummies and people with tourniquets, CPR, AED, all that good stuff, running through those scenarios as a team at least a couple times a year. And then annually, at least once a year, having a true large scale, full scale exercise where this would be a good opportunity to contact law enforcement, local fire department, all those different agencies, and say, hey, we're going to put on a large scale scenario based training where we're going to invite, you guys, we're inviting all of the ministry teams to be represented. So children's ministry, hospitality, greeters, ushers, safety team, everybody's going to participate, getting lots of role players, lots of elements, so that this large scale training can be carried out and everybody can be on the same page. Scenario-based training is very, very important. Just like qualifications are important to make sure that everybody's maintaining proficiency on that armed component of the team, scenario-based training really helps get a level of stress inoculation. It depends how far you go with it, but some simple things you can do to at least induce a little bit of stress throughout different scenarios is get people moving, doing some exercise, getting that heart rate up, working through things. And then, the role players can induce some of that stress, like verbally and even physically. Totally depends on skill level and where you're at in that training progression. Um, Very much encourages teamwork and exposes some of those deficiencies, cracks, and opportunities to grow together and do better. And again, achieve that highest possible level of service, encourages refinement. And because really, anytime you run through scenarios and you see some things that you want to adjust, most people are on the same page that, hey, let's make those adjustments and serve better. Documentation of training. I know documentation has come up several times throughout this session in terms of post-incident, but also training. Document it. It's going to be good from a liability perspective to document what types of training's been done and why. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen, that applies to, really every instance of documentation that's been discussed throughout this session here. Recalling at a later date. And then tracking. Tracking can be a huge component of training, where if we have some issues that are kind of coming up over and over and over, let's say in the scenarios every year, we have individuals that are lacking in the verbal side of things, talking to people. Maybe they're really good at some of the hard skills, but the soft skills need some work. That's where that tracking piece can be very, very helpful. Of seeing, okay, we've got some deficiencies in this area. Let's slot a training to address some of that and really, really work on refining that. External learning, again, like I mentioned earlier, avoiding echo chambers, because if we just have a couple voices that are influencing everything, it can be very easy to think that the things we're doing, the way we're doing them, are the most up to date. Conferences can be a huge thing. I know locally we have a few free ones, some low cost ones, but then of course there's always these conferences that bring in expensive speakers and high level training and that kind of stuff. Conferences kind of can bridge a couple gaps. There can be some training suggestions that are there. It's going to depend on the conference. There can be some networking opportunities where that's a good place to meet with some other team members and team leaders and say, hey, what are you guys doing? What's working well? What are some gaps? Here's what we're doing. Here's some deficiencies. Here's some things we're working through. Here's some things we want to work toward. How do we do that? Everything from figuring out what works, what doesn't. And again, I know I keep using that tax analogy, but if somebody else has bought some equipment and it didn't end up working out, or it didn't last, and you can hear that from somebody else, then you could just go ahead and not. Individual training, again, like I said, we should be having that individualized training where individuals are seeking out training on their own and bringing that back to their team and bettering their whole team as well as themselves in an effort to better their team and their service. Certification standards. This is where we want to make sure that we do have some minimums, back to that policy discussion. So in my opinion, medical, in this day and age, a good solid CPR, AED first aid curriculum is going to have some other elements to it. So finding a good solid CPR, AED first aid certification that can be maintained, as well as like Stop the Bleed, Narcan. There's some other things that have become very commonplace that I would say are a good minimum starting point for everybody to have certification and proficiency in those areas. Firearms, if you're in, a state that calls it a concealed pistol license, concealed weapons license, concealed carry license, if you're required to have some documentation, permit to carry a concealed pistol, that can sound very obvious, but that is obviously non-negotiable if the individuals are going to be armed. Of course, we got to make sure everything's being done lawfully. Qualifying twice a year, in my opinion, that's a good minimum standard. That way you're making sure at least a couple times a year, like, okay, good, everybody's still up to par in terms of their proficiency level. Making sure that long-term health is a focus. We want to make sure everything we're doing is sustainable, built to last. Think long-term and big picture. So hopefully you're of the belief that your church, your team, and everything within it is going to outlast us, because we're a lot more perishable than an organization, a church. And at the end of the day, the mission of the church is going to be as long as time. So having that good big picture long-term focus and ensuring that we're building things that are going to last and serve well for years and years and years. A part of that becomes succession planning, like thinking about future leaders, recruitment, and retention. So when we think about recruitment, we think about how are we going to get new people on this team? Because if we only have 10 and we never add anybody, at some point, we're going to age out. People might leave, go to a different church. They might get to a point where they're not able or willing to serve in this role anymore. So that recruitment needs to be a constant focus. How you go about recruitment, again, is going to be where it aligns with your goals and your strategies and that kind of stuff. But some things that I've seen work really well is when a team sees somebody that has a good mentality and heart and skill set, and they would be a good asset to the team, approaching those individuals and saying, hey, would you be interested in the safety team? Obviously, it's going to be a much longer conversation than just that and a yes or no question. But reaching out to these individuals, when you have people approach you that say, hey, I want to be on your safety team, making sure that there's a vetting process in place. We've addressed some of the different challenges that can be in play there from individuals that are maybe seeking this role for motives that aren't going to be ideal to the long-term success and service of this team. But thinking about those future leaders early, like I said, some of the team leads that get burnt out, that are bearing a lot of burden, and it's really become a second job for them. And it's pretty few and far between that team leads are paid. That, again, this is a voluntary profession. Even though it's voluntary, I still view it as a professional atmosphere where we're serving to a very, very high standard and doing so extremely well. Retention is going to be another component of that. So that comes back to culture, making sure everybody feels valued. They understand the importance of what they're doing, the depth of what they're doing, and that they're being built and growing together with the team, and really just ensuring that we get the right people in the right place, and then we keep those people in those places, and we grow. So we keep all the good things that we've built, and we don't allow that to stagnate and degrade. Thinking about how we're measuring success. So again, professionalism through routine incidents. So when we do have an incident, it's being handled well. It's being handled within, legal compliance, policy compliance, guidelines, all that good stuff. So when we see an incident that was handled well, we can celebrate that. We can say, okay, awesome. We're being successful as we're handling these things we've prepared for and trained for. Debriefing is, again, a very good opportunity to do that. Celebrate those wins, learn from the losses, and just continue to refine and grow and be as successful as possible. So if your church is incurring no incidents, that could mean successful. Deterrence, prevention, proactive, that can be a good thing. I would caution you that could also indicate lack of detection. So if you're sitting in a place right now where you say, yeah, we never have any problems at our church, but you don't have a safety team, you may have some issues and some concerns, but they're just not being detected because there's not a team and a process in place. So there might be some things festering. So I just want to suggest that no incidents, depending on the level of structure, procedures, and processes in place. No incidents could just be an indicator of we're not detecting things, or it could be an indicator that our prevention, detection, and deterrence strategies are working very well. So that could be a little subjective. So as we close here, what can you do today? We've talked about a lot. Like I said, this is not the destination. This is either a good review for refinement or a good starting place to think through a lot of these things. If you don't currently have a team and you're working on getting one started, I would encourage you to get started. I've seen teams that they focus on the policy, the procedures, the guidelines, and I'm currently aware of a team that's been working on that for a year and a half, and they're just not getting off the starting line. There's a lot of encouragement there, and so sometimes you just have to start. So I'm not saying to do that willy-nilly and without methods and intentionality and all that good stuff, but getting started is the only way to run a race. Review making sure that we're constantly coming back and looking. Much like I said, you're never fully trained. There is no destination here. Things change over time. We want to make sure that we're up to date and we're best serving for where we're at. So we want to make sure that as society changes, as methods change, technologies change, patterns change, that we're constantly reviewing and making sure that at this point in time, this is the best level of service that we can offer to our church congregation visitors and anybody we come into contact with. That kind of goes hand in hand with refinement, where when we do our review and we identify some of these things, that we are open to that change and we're open to those updated methods and technology and methodology strategies, making sure that just because what we did in the past worked, that we're not so stuck on that we're not willing to implement some progress and some change and that kind of stuff. Thank you very much for listening to this session. I greatly appreciate it. I hope you learned some things. If you have any questions, I would love to hear those, whether it's through our website, email, please let us know. We're also on Facebook, YouTube. There's a YouTube channel podcast, which is obviously where you're listening to this most likely. And we would love any questions. Go ahead and throw them in the comments section or hop on the website, send us a message, whatever is going to work best for you. I would love the opportunity to answer any questions. And like I said, thank you very much. Absolutely appreciate you listening to this and considering and thinking through a lot of this. If you're building a team, starting a team, involved on a team, whatever it is you're doing, I really can't say enough how much I appreciate what you do. This ministry work matters. It's important. And I'm very thankful for everybody that's willing to be involved in it. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Prepared to Prevail. Please visit preparedtoprevail.com for more resources and educational materials.